It is, of course, as ever with these incidents, impossible to say really at this stage whether this is just a one-off lone wolf incident or whether there's some kind of larger network involved.
Yes, and I think on the whole, even if it's a larger network, we're looking at very small groups of individuals who take it on themselves to supposedly represent communities that they've never consulted or engaged with. And I think the tragedy is that these incidents are becoming all too predictable nowadays. I was slightly weary watching the pictures on television last night, trying to wonder how many times I've seen this and how many times I will continue to see this, whilst security services the world over continue to say that the only solution is greater security measures, which we must all know is not possible because you cannot assure the security of all people in all places at all times.
There was a report recently here in France, I know, saying that the state of emergency, which of course has been imposed since those attacks of last year here in France, actually doesn't have much of an effect. And as you say there, perhaps showing the fact that this lorry, pretty easily, by all accounts, managed to get through this barrier on the seafront at Nice and drive for an enormous 2 kilometres before it was stopped.
Well, indeed, and tragically, I imagine, most of your listeners must recognise that anybody could do this, and I think, unfortunately, the consequence of extending security measures and states of emergency and putting more armed police in every public place can actually be quite a dispiriting one as people begin to sense themselves living in a society that's lost control. I think we would be far better off as a society beginning to try and discuss more robustly the kind of cultural drivers that have led to the situations that we now confront and what we could do for the long term, while recognizing that probably in the short term, anyone that offers instant solutions is probably selling snake oil.
How do you do that, though, would you say? Because, that sounds like an enormous task of actually rewriting the way countries and different religions and cultures interact between each other.
It is an enormous task, but it's one that if we don't begin, we don't begin. I think what we see, if indeed the perpetrator is, as has been identified, a 31-year-old French Tunisian who was known to the authorities for petty crime, what we see is a fairly typical perpetrator of lone wolf attacks, someone who sense themselves as disaffected with society, increasingly distance themselves to some extent from society whilst being fully integrated in it in other respects. But above all, who was allowed by never being challenged in their nihilistic fantasies to develop views and opinions that were never confronted in a public space. The fact that these individuals represent no one, no community, they don't engage with others, is precisely what allows them to be as barbaric as they are, because they don't have to account for themselves afterwards. They're not trying to build a constituency, they're not trying to change the world, and it's time we started calling them what they are, which is nihilistic murderers.
And what about intelligence within this? Because presumably the actual intelligence agencies could be beefed up, because that's not something which is completely impossible to do and could well manage to catch some people before they take out this kind of action.
Well, we can endlessly beef up the intelligence services, but I remember Eliza Manningham-Buller, when she was head of MI5 a decade or so ago, pointing out that ultimately there's a limit to what the security service can do. And her co-head of the Secret Intelligence Service at the time, Richard Dearlove, has subsequently gone on record to note how the intelligence services now spend well over half their budget or more addressing the problem of Islamist terrorism, whereas during the Cold War they never spent quite as much addressing the Soviet Union, and therefore there's possibly a loss of proportionality, and we're heading off in the wrong direction. My concern is that we increasingly confront a large number of young individuals in society who have never had their opinions challenged from nursery through high school all the way to university for fear of causing offence or hurting their emotions. And that, I think, will have a dramatic effect on these kind of incidents for the period ahead. even from those who have no connection to the Muslim world whatsoever, as indeed most of these individuals have none, because really we're looking at almost a lost generation of individuals, small but very devastating in their actions.
And presumably you think this is something which could well happen right across the world. I mean, of course, we've had other incidents across the world, notably, of course, in Belgium over the last few months. But it's not just France and Belgium who could be at risk here.
Absolutely not. It could be anywhere. When you hear of reports from France and Belgium of high school teachers saying they fear teaching aspects of the history curriculum in their class for fear of being jeered at or being called offensive, racist or imperialist, and therefore they avoid instructing their students, you begin to recognise that this is a problem even in this country, where I'm sat, in the United Kingdom. There are government reports advising teachers on what to do in terms of teaching what they describe as difficult and sensitive subjects. When a country fears teaching about its past and fears presenting a narrative, however correct or incorrect it might be, then you have to begin to recognise that part of the problem is the crisis of confidence of the authorities in that country that indulges individuals in their sense of disaffection.